My name is Magnolia Sterling, and I never thought my own parents would drag me to court over buying my dream house. But there I was, sitting across from them in a courtroom, listening to their lawyer argue that I should hand over my 3-bedroom Victorian home to my unemployed sister Isabella because family comes first. The judge looked confused, I felt betrayed, and my sister smirked like she had already won. This is the story of how my family's greed nearly destroyed everything I worked for, and how karma eventually served them the justice they deserved. Before we dive into this incredible family drama, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Are you Team Magnolia, or do you think families should always stick together no matter what? Hit that like button if you have ever felt betrayed by your own family, and make sure to subscribe because this story has twists that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood loyalty. Trust me, you will want to see how this unfolds. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I am 28 years old, work as a senior financial analyst at a prestigious investment firm in downtown Seattle, and have been saving money since I graduated college 6 years ago. Unlike my 31-year-old sister Isabella, who has been job hopping between retail positions and living with our parents for the past decade, I have always been financially responsible. Isabella dropped out of college twice, once from communications and once from art therapy, claiming the programs were too restrictive for her creative spirit. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs through school, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, and immediately landed my current position. Our parents, Margaret and Robert Sterling, always made excuses for Isabella's failures while holding me to impossible standards. When I finally saved enough for a down payment, I found the perfect house in the Ballard neighborhood. It was a 1920 Victorian that needed some work but had incredible potential. The seller was an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who wanted to sell quickly due to health issues. I made a competitive offer of $450,000, which was accepted within 24 hours. I was over the moon and called my parents to share the good news. Instead of congratulations, my mother's first words were, "Well, what about Isabella? She needs a place to live too." I explained that I had been saving for this house for years, that it was in my name alone, and that Isabella could continue living with them or find her own place. The conversation quickly turned hostile. My father accused me of being selfish and suggested I should have consulted the family before making such a major financial decision. I reminded him that I was an adult with my own income and savings, but he dismissed this entirely. My mother then dropped the bombshell that shattered my trust forever. She revealed that they had been planning to help Isabella buy a house using money from their retirement fund, but now that I had beaten her to it, they expected me to either let Isabella move in with me or sell the house to her at cost. When I refused, explaining that this was my dream home and my investment, my mother said something that still haunts me. Blood is thicker than water, Magnolia. Real families share everything. I tried to reason with them over the following weeks. I offered to help Isabella create a budget, find better employment, or even co-sign an apartment lease. But nothing satisfied them except their demand that I hand over my house. Isabella, who had contributed nothing to this conversation except entitled demands, began posting on social media about how her selfish sister was keeping her homeless. The social media campaign was particularly cruel. Isabella created posts showing pictures of rundown apartments she claimed to be viewing, captioned with messages about how some people forget where they come from and money changes people. She tagged our extended family members, many of whom began commenting with supportive messages for her and criticisms of me. My cousin Jennifer, who barely knew the full story, commented that I should remember family comes first. My uncle David shared Isabella's post with additional commentary about how success should lift the whole family up. The narrative being constructed was that I was a cold-hearted career woman who had forgotten her struggling sister. What made this campaign even more insidious was that Isabella was presenting herself as actively job searching and apartment hunting, when I knew from my parents that she was sleeping until noon most days and had turned down several job offers because they were beneath her qualifications. She had also rejected multiple affordable apartment options because they were not in trendy neighborhoods. During this time, I discovered something that changed my entire perspective on my family's financial situation. While reviewing my parents' previous tax documents for a different matter, I noticed significant discrepancies in their reported income and assets. My father had always claimed they lived paycheck to paycheck on his teacher's pension and my mother's part-time bookkeeping income. However, the documents showed substantial investment accounts, rental property income, and even a small business that I had never heard of. When I confronted them about these discoveries, they became defensive and accused me of snooping in their private affairs. But the evidence was clear. My parents had far more money than they had ever admitted, yet they had consistently refused to help either of their daughters financially throughout college and early adulthood. This revelation recontextualized every financial struggle I had endured. The nights I worked double shifts to pay for textbooks, the summers I spent doing manual labor instead of internships because I needed immediate income, the years I lived in shared apartments with unreliable roommates because I could not afford my own place. All of this while my parents had sufficient assets to help but chose not to. I also realized that Isabella likely knew about the family's hidden wealth, which explained her confident expectation that resources would eventually flow her direction. Her lack of urgency about employment and her entitled attitude about housing made perfect sense if she believed she was guaranteed financial support eventually. The final straw came when I received a certified letter from a law firm representing my parents. They were not just asking me to reconsider. They were actually threatening legal action if I did not remedy the family housing situation by either selling the house to Isabella or allowing her to establish residency there. The letter cited obscure property laws and made vague threats about undue influence and family financial obligations. When that certified letter arrived at my office, my hands literally trembled as I read it. Morrison, Burke & Associates was not some strip mall law firm. They were expensive downtown attorneys who specialized in family wealth disputes. The fact that my parents could afford their services while claiming to be financially struggling confirmed my suspicions about their hidden assets. The letter demanded that I appear at a family mediation session within 2 weeks or face formal litigation. It claimed that my purchase of the house violated implied family financial agreements and that Isabella had reasonable expectations of family housing support that I was now willfully preventing. The legal language was intimidating and sophisticated, clearly designed to pressure me into compliance. I immediately contacted my own attorney, Sarah Martinez, who specialized in real estate and family law. After reviewing the letter, she was both amused and outraged. "Magnolia," she said, "this is legal intimidation at its finest. They have absolutely no grounds for any of these claims, but they are hoping you will be scared enough to cave to their demands." Sarah explained that property rights in Washington state are very clear once I purchased the house with my own funds, and the deed was in my name. My parents had zero legal claim to it. The concept of implied family financial agreements was essentially meaningless unless there were written contracts or documented promises, which there were not. However, she warned me that my parents seemed prepared to spend significant money on this fight, which meant they might file frivolous lawsuits just to harass me. "Sometimes people with more money than sense will weaponize the legal system," she told me. "We need to be prepared for them to actually follow through on these threats." The mediation session was scheduled at Morrison, Burke & Associates conference room downtown. I arrived with Sarah, expecting to meet with a neutral mediator and hopefully resolve this misunderstanding. Instead, I walked into what felt like an ambush. My parents sat on one side of a polished conference table with their attorney, David Morrison, who looked like he charged $500 per hour just to breathe. Isabella was there too, dressed uncharacteristically professionally and carrying a folder of documents. On the table were printed copies of property records, financial statements, and even photographs of the house I had purchased. Morrison began the meeting by outlining what he called the family's position. According to him, my parents had made substantial financial investments in my education and early career that created legitimate expectations about how I would use my resulting financial success. He argued that buying a house without consulting my family violated these understanding and commitments. Isabella then presented her folder of documents, which included job applications she claimed to have submitted, apartment listings she said she had inquired about, and even a budget showing how she could afford the mortgage payments on my house if it were transferred to her. The presentation was surprisingly polished for someone who normally could not organize her own schedule. When it was my turn to respond, Sarah methodically demolished their arguments. She pointed out that no written agreements existed regarding family financial obligations, that I had purchased the house entirely with my own earnings and savings, and that Isabella's claimed inability to find housing was contradicted by the numerous affordable options we could identify in the local market. Sarah also raised questions about my parents' financial situation that clearly made Morrison uncomfortable. She noted the discrepancy between their claimed poverty and their ability to afford expensive legal representation, and suggested that if they truly wanted to help Isabella with housing, they had the means to do so without involving me. The meeting deteriorated quickly after that. My mother began crying and claiming I had changed since achieving financial success. My father accused me of being poisoned by materialism and forgetting my family values. Isabella dramatically declared that she felt abandoned and betrayed by the one person who should understand her struggles. Morrison attempted to regain control by making an ultimatum. Either I agreed to transfer the house to Isabella for the amount I had paid, or they would file a formal lawsuit within the week. Sarah responded that we welcomed their lawsuit because it would give us the opportunity to conduct discovery about my parents' true financial situation. This threat seemed to catch them off guard. Discovery would mean they would have to provide complete financial records, tax returns, and business documents under oath. Morrison quickly suggested they reassess their options and adjourn the meeting. But my family was not finished. Over the next few days, the harassment intensified dramatically. Isabella began showing up at my workplace during lunch hours, sometimes crying in the lobby about her homelessness, loud enough for my colleagues to hear. My parents started calling my direct supervisor at work, claiming there was a family emergency that required my immediate attention. The social media campaign also escalated. Isabella created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Isabella Find Safe Housing" that painted me as a wealthy sister who had abandoned her struggling sibling. The page included carefully cropped photos that made her look more desperate than she actually was, and implied that I was preventing her from accessing family resources that could solve her housing crisis. Extended family members who had initially supported Isabella began reaching out to me privately, asking for my side of the story. My cousin Jennifer called to tell me that Isabella had been asking relatives for money, claiming she needed funds for legal fees to fight my sister's selfishness. My Aunt Patricia mentioned that Isabella had approached her about borrowing money for a deposit on an apartment, but then never followed up when Patricia offered to help her search for affordable options. These conversations revealed a pattern I had not previously recognized. Isabella had been manipulating family members for months, possibly years, by presenting different versions of her financial situation to different people. She told some relatives that our parents were too poor to help her, while telling others that I was blocking family assistance. The most disturbing discovery came from my grandfather's estate attorney, who contacted me about an unrelated matter. During our conversation, he mentioned that Isabella had recently inquired about accelerating her inheritance and had asked detailed questions about the family trust fund that would eventually pass to both sisters. This revelation was shocking because I had no idea a trust fund existed. When I confronted my parents about it, they initially denied everything, but eventually admitted that yes, both Isabella and I were beneficiaries of a trust established by my grandparents. The trust contained substantial assets but would not be distributed until both sisters reached age 35. Or until specific educational and career milestones were achieved. Isabella was apparently trying to access these funds early to purchase property, and my successful house purchase had complicated her plans. If she could establish that family resources should be shared equally and immediately, she could argue for early trust distribution. My parents' lawsuit was not just about the house. It was about establishing legal precedent for how family wealth should be distributed. This trust fund revelation changed everything. What had seemed like petty family jealousy was actually a calculated attempt to manipulate inheritance laws and family wealth distribution. I realized I was not just fighting for my house. I was protecting my future financial security and defending myself against a coordinated fraud. Sarah immediately recommended that I hire additional legal expertise. We brought in Michael Thompson, an estate planning attorney who specialized in trust law, and Jennifer Walsh, a financial investigator who could help uncover the full scope of my family's assets. The legal team was expensive, but I understood that this battle would determine my financial future. Michael's analysis of the trust documents was enlightening and disturbing. The trust contained over $2 million in assets, including stocks, bonds, and several pieces of real estate. The distribution requirements were specific beneficiaries could access funds early for education, starting a business, or purchasing a primary residence, but only with unanimous approval from the three trustees, my parents and my grandfather's former attorney, Edmund Clark. Isabella had been attempting to access trust funds for months, but her requests had been denied because she could not demonstrate financial responsibility or present viable plans for the money. My successful house purchase proved that I met the criteria for early distribution, which apparently infuriated Isabella because it highlighted her own failures. The trust documents also revealed why my parents had hidden their wealth. As trustees, they received annual fees for managing the trust assets, plus they had been using trust property as rental income for years. If the trust was distributed early, they would lose this ongoing revenue stream. Their lawsuit was not just helping Isabella. It was protecting their own financial interests. Jennifer Walsh's financial investigation uncovered even more disturbing information. My parents owned 4 rental properties that they managed through a shell company, had investment accounts worth over $800,000, and were collecting Social Security and pension benefits while actively hiding assets from tax authorities. Most shocking of all, Isabella had been receiving unreported monthly payments from my parents for over 3 years. These payments, totaling almost $1,500 per month, were being disguised as property management fees for work Isabella was supposedly doing for their rental business. In reality, Isabella was being paid to do minimal bookkeeping, while my parents claimed she was unemployed and struggling financially. Armed with this evidence, Sarah filed a countersuit against my parents for fraud harassment and attempted inheritance manipulation. We also reported their tax evasion and asset hiding to the appropriate authorities. The legal momentum had completely shifted in our direction. But the most valuable alliance I formed during this period was completely unexpected. Edmund Clark, the family trust attorney and third trustee, contacted me directly after learning about the lawsuit. Clark was in his 70s and had managed our family's trust for over 20 years. He was disgusted by my parents' behavior and wanted to help expose their manipulation. Clark revealed that Isabella had been pressuring him for months to approve early trust distribution for a house purchase. But she had never actually applied for mortgages or demonstrated serious intent to buy property. When my parents claimed I was preventing Isabella from accessing family resources, Clark realized they were misrepresenting the trust's purpose and his role as an independent trustee. Clark agreed to testify about my parents' attempts to manipulate trust distributions and their misrepresentation of Isabella's financial situation. He also provided documentation showing that my parents had been using trust assets for personal expenses, which was a serious breach of their fiduciary duties as trustees. With Clark's support, we petitioned the court to remove my parents as trustees and conduct a full audit of trust management over the past decade. This legal action terrified my parents because it threatened to expose years of financial impropriety and potential embezzlement. The harassment campaign against me intensified as my parents realized their legal position was collapsing. Isabella began showing up at my house at all hours, sometimes bringing friends to stage dramatic confrontations on my front lawn. She would scream about how I was stealing her inheritance and destroying the family loud enough for my neighbors to hear. My parents started contacting my clients at work, claiming I was involved in unethical financial practices and suggesting they should reconsider doing business with me. This was potentially career-destroying behavior that could have seriously damaged my professional reputation. Fortunately, my supervisor was supportive and helped me document these harassment attempts. The extended family drama also reached new levels of toxicity. Isabella organized what she called intervention lunches with various relatives, where she would present her version of events and ask family members to pressure me into doing the right thing. Several cousins and aunts received carefully crafted packets of information that portrayed me as greedy and Isabella as a victim of my selfishness. However, these manipulation attempts began backfiring as family members started comparing notes. My cousin Jennifer noticed that Isabella's story kept changing, depending on her audience. My Aunt Patricia realized that Isabella had been lying about her job search after Patricia offered to provide employment references, and Isabella became evasive about specific positions she had supposedly applied for. Most importantly, my grandfather's older brother, Uncle William, decided to conduct his own investigation after Isabella approached him for money. Uncle William was a retired accountant who still had sharp analytical skills and a healthy suspicion of financial stories that did not add up. Uncle William discovered that Isabella's social media posts about apartment hunting were largely fabricated. The apartments she claimed to be viewing were either already rented or priced far above what she could afford. Her GoFundMe page contained several false claims about her employment status and living situation. Even her dramatic photos of unsuitable housing options were taken from online listings for properties she had never actually visited. When Uncle William confronted Isabella about these discrepancies, she became hostile and accused him of betraying family by questioning her honesty. This reaction convinced him that Isabella was running a deliberate scam, and he began sharing his findings with other family members. The tide of family opinion started shifting in my direction as more relatives realized they had been manipulated. My cousin David, who had initially criticized me on social media, publicly apologized and deleted his supportive comments about Isabella. My Aunt Sarah began asking pointed questions about why my parents could afford expensive lawyers if they were truly struggling financially. This growing family support gave me emotional strength, but I knew the legal battle was far from over. My parents and Isabella were facing potential criminal charges for fraud and tax evasion, which made them increasingly desperate and unpredictable. The next phase of this conflict would test every alliance I had built and reveal just how far my own family was willing to go to maintain their financial deception. I was about to learn that even people you trust completely can surprise you when enough money is at stake. Just when I thought my legal team was unbeatable, the ground shifted beneath my feet in the most devastating way possible. 3 weeks into building our case against my parents, Michael Thompson, the estate planning attorney I trusted with my financial future, delivered news that shattered my confidence completely. During what I assumed was a routine strategy meeting, Michael sat across from me with an expression I had never seen before. His usual professional demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. Sarah sensed the tension immediately and asked what was wrong. Michael cleared his throat and announced that he had discovered a conflict of interest that would require him to withdraw from my case immediately. My heart sank as he explained that his law firm had previously represented my parents in establishing their shell company for the rental properties. Although this work had been completed by a different attorney in his firm several years ago, the ethical guidelines required him to step away from any litigation that might adversely affect former clients. The timing could not have been worse. We were scheduled to present our evidence about trust fund manipulation to the court the following week, and Michael had been preparing the most technical aspects of our argument. His withdrawal would delay our case by at least a month, while I found new representation, giving my parents time to reorganize their defense and potentially hide more evidence. But the real betrayal came 30 minutes later when Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. Edmund Clark, the family trust attorney who had been our most valuable ally, was calling to inform us that he could no longer testify on my behalf. The reason he gave was shocking. My parents had threatened to sue him personally for breach of fiduciary duty if he continued supporting my case. Clark explained that my parents claimed he had violated his neutral trustee obligations by sharing trust information with me and taking sides in a family dispute. While Clark believed their threats were baseless, defending himself would require hiring his own attorneys and potentially facing years of litigation. At his age, he simply could not afford the stress and expense of a prolonged legal battle. Without Clark's testimony, we lost our most credible witness about my parents' trust fund manipulation and Isabella's fraudulent requests for early distribution. Clark had been the one person who could definitively prove that my parents had been lying about the family's financial situation and Isabella's legitimate need for housing assistance. Sarah tried to reassure me that we still had strong evidence, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Losing two key allies in one day felt like more than coincidence. It felt like my parents had orchestrated a coordinated attack on my legal defense. My suspicions were confirmed the next morning when I discovered that Michael Thompson's law firm had been retained by my parents as additional counsel for their case. The conflict of interest that had forced Michael to withdraw from representing me had immediately become an opportunity for him to work against me instead. This revelation was particularly devastating because Michael knew all of our legal strategies, had copies of our evidence, and understood exactly how we planned to prove my parents' fraud. By switching sides, he had essentially handed my parents a roadmap for defeating every argument we intended to make. The betrayal felt personal in a way that my family's behavior had not. I had paid Michael substantial fees and trusted him with sensitive information about my finances and family relationships. His decision to abandon my case and immediately work for my opponents felt like the ultimate professional betrayal. Sarah was furious and immediately filed complaints with the State Bar Association about Michael's ethical violations, but those investigations would take months to complete. In the meantime, we were facing an emergency hearing about my parents' request for a temporary restraining order that would prevent me from selling or modifying my house while their lawsuit proceeded. The hearing was a disaster. Michael Thompson appeared alongside David Morrison as co-counsel for my parents, and together they presented a sophisticated argument that my house purchase had been designed to circumvent family financial obligations and deny Isabella her rightful inheritance. Without Edmund Clark to contradict their claims about trust fund management, their version of events sounded plausible to the judge. Most damaging of all, Michael revealed private conversations he had had with me about my motivations for buying the house and my feelings about Isabella's financial irresponsibility. He testified that I had explicitly stated my intention to punish Isabella for her poor life choices by excluding her from family property investments. These statements were taken completely out of context. I had expressed frustration about Isabella's entitled attitude during confidential attorney-client conversations, but Michael was now presenting those private comments as evidence of malicious intent. Sarah objected repeatedly, but the damage was already done. The judge granted my parents temporary restraining order, which meant I could not sell, refinance, or make major modifications to my house without court approval. Even worse, the judge ordered me to allow Isabella to establish temporary residency in my house, while the lawsuit proceeded, essentially forcing me to live with the sister who is trying to steal my property. That night, sitting in my dream house with Isabella smugly unpacking her belongings in my guest room, I felt more defeated than I had ever felt in my life. My own legal team had betrayed me. My strongest ally had abandoned me, and my family's manipulation had succeeded in turning the legal system against me. Isabella made the situation even worse by treating my house like she already owned it. She rearranged furniture, invited friends over without asking, and made loud phone calls about her temporary housing victory and how she expected to win permanent ownership soon. She also began documenting everything I did, claiming she was gathering evidence of my hostile behavior toward her forced residency. The harassment from my parents intensified now that they believed they were winning. My mother called me daily to lecture me about accepting reality and making peace with the family's decision. My father sent long emails about how my selfish materialism had forced them to take legal action to protect Isabella's welfare. Even worse, my parents began contacting my employer again, but this time they claimed I was involved in ongoing litigation that might affect my professional responsibilities. They suggested that my company should consider whether an employee facing fraud allegations should continue handling client accounts. This career sabotage was the most frightening aspect of their campaign because it threatened my ability to pay for legal representation and maintain my financial independence. Without my job, I would be unable to afford the ongoing legal battle, which would force me to surrender and accept their demands. As I lay awake that night listening to Isabella talking loudly on her phone about her housing victory, I realized that my family's betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. They were not just trying to steal my house, they were systematically destroying every aspect of my life to force my complete submission to their will. Just when everything seemed hopeless, an unexpected phone call changed the entire trajectory of my case. Jennifer Walsh, the financial investigator, contacted me with news that would expose the full scope of my family's fraud and bring powerful new allies into my corner. Jennifer had been quietly conducting her own investigation into my parents' financial activities while the legal drama unfolded. What she discovered was far more extensive than any of us had initially suspected. My parents were not just hiding assets and manipulating trust funds. They were running a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that had been operating for over a decade. The rental properties I knew about were only the beginning. Jennifer had uncovered evidence of at least 12 different properties that my parents owned through various shell companies and nominee arrangements. They had been systematically purchasing distressed properties, making minimal improvements, and renting them to low-income tenants at inflated rates while claiming rental losses on their tax returns. More shocking was the discovery that Isabella had been actively involved in this scheme for years. The property management fees she had been receiving were actually payments for helping falsify rental income reports and tenant documentation. Isabella had been creating fake leases, forged tenant applications, and fraudulent maintenance receipts that allowed my parents to claim substantial tax deductions while hiding their actual rental income. Jennifer had also traced suspicious financial transfers that suggested my parents had been embezzling funds from the family trust for their personal real estate investments. Over the past 5 years, they had systematically moved trust assets into their shell companies, used those funds to purchase rental properties, and then claimed the properties as personal assets while continuing to manage the depleted trust. This evidence explained why my parents had been so desperate to prevent trust auditing and why they had fought so hard to maintain control as trustees. They were not just stealing from Isabella and me. They were running a criminal enterprise that used our inheritance as startup capital for their illegal activities. Jennifer's investigation had attracted the attention of federal authorities who were already investigating similar rental property fraud schemes in the Seattle area. When she presented her findings to the FBI's white-collar crime unit, they immediately opened a formal investigation into my parents' activities and requested all documentation related to their property holdings and trust management. The FBI agent assigned to the case, Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, contacted Sarah directly to inform us that my parents were now subjects of a federal criminal investigation. Agent Rodriguez explained that rental property fraud had become a significant problem in Washington state, and my parents' activities fit a pattern of organized financial crimes they had been tracking for months. This federal involvement completely changed the dynamic of our family dispute. My parents were no longer just facing a civil lawsuit about property rights. They were potentially facing federal criminal charges for fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement that could result in substantial prison sentences and complete asset forfeiture. Agent Rodriguez also provided information that helped us understand Michael Thompson's betrayal. The FBI had been investigating Thompson's law firm for several months based on suspicious financial transactions and potential involvement in real estate fraud schemes. Thompson's decision to withdraw from my case and immediately represent my parents was likely motivated by his own legal jeopardy rather than simple greed. With federal authorities now involved, Edmund Clark reconsidered his decision to withdraw from our case. Agent Rodriguez assured him that testifying about trust fund manipulation was not only legally protected, but actually required as part of the federal investigation. Clark agreed to provide testimony and documentation that would prove my parents had been systematically stealing trust assets for years. The most surprising new ally came from within my parents' own extended network. Janet Morrison, the office manager at David Morrison's law firm, contacted Sarah through an intermediary with explosive information about my parents' legal strategy. Janet had been working at Morrison Burke and Associates for over 15 years and had never seen anything like my family's case. She was disturbed by the firm's willingness to pursue what she considered frivolous litigation against me while helping my parents hide evidence of their criminal activities. According to Janet, my parents had admitted to David Morrison that their lawsuit against me was primarily designed to delay federal investigators and prevent asset seizure. They hoped that by tying up their property holdings in civil litigation, they could claim the assets were disputed and avoid immediate forfeiture if criminal charges were filed. Janet also revealed that Isabella had been secretly recording conversations with me while living in my house, attempting to gather evidence that could be used to portray me as psychologically unstable or financially irresponsible. These recordings were being edited and manipulated to create false impressions of my statements and behavior. Most importantly, Janet had copies of internal communications between Morrison and Thompson that showed they were coordinating their legal strategies specifically to help my parents hide assets and obstruct the federal investigation. These documents proved that both attorneys were actively participating in the criminal conspiracy, rather than simply representing clients in a civil dispute. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, Sarah filed an emergency motion to dismiss my parents' lawsuit and remove the restraining order that had forced Isabella to live in my house. We also provided all of Janet Morrison's documentation to Agent Rodriguez, which significantly accelerated the federal investigation. The legal momentum shifted dramatically in our favor over the following week. The judge reviewing our emergency motion was clearly disturbed by the evidence of criminal activity and immediately dissolved the restraining order. Isabella was given 24 hours to remove all personal belongings from my house and was prohibited from returning without my explicit permission. Federal agents executed search warrants on my parents' home, all of their rental properties, and the offices of both Morrison Burke and Associates and Thompson's law firm. The searches yielded extensive documentation of the financial fraud scheme, including computers, financial records, and communications that proved the scope of their criminal activities. My parents' reaction to these developments revealed just how deep their deception had been. Instead of expressing remorse or attempting to make amends with me, they doubled down on their attacks and began claiming they were victims of a vindictive daughter who had manipulated federal authorities to persecute her own family. Isabella's behavior became even more erratic once she was forced to leave my house. She began posting increasingly unhinged social media content, claiming that I had destroyed the family and ruined her life out of jealousy and spite. She also started making vague threats about exposing the real truth about my character and business practices. These threats were particularly concerning because Isabella still had access to some of my personal information and financial documents from her time living in my house. Agent Rodriguez advised me to change all passwords, close shared accounts, and monitor my credit reports for suspicious activity. The extended family's reaction to these revelations was swift and decisive. Once the federal investigation became public knowledge, relatives who had initially supported Isabella began distancing themselves completely. Uncle William, who had already suspected Isabella of lying, became one of my strongest advocates and offered to testify about her manipulation attempts. My cousin, Jennifer, who had initially criticized me on social media, reached out with a heartfelt apology and an offer to help in any way possible. She admitted that Isabella had been manipulating family members for years with false stories about financial emergencies and family crises. As the federal investigation progressed, it became clear that my family's criminal activities had affected far more people than just Isabella and me. Several of their tenants had been victims of illegal rent increases and fraudulent lease agreements. Other family members had unknowingly participated in tax fraud by providing false statements about property ownership and rental arrangements. The scope of their crimes was staggering, but I knew that justice was finally being served. My parents and Isabella would face serious consequences for their years of deception and fraud, and I would finally be free to rebuild my life without their toxic manipulation. The final collapse of my family's criminal enterprise came faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks of the federal raids, both of my parents and Isabella were arrested on multiple felony charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, and money laundering. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Federal investigators had recovered over 2 years of communications detailing their fraud scheme, including text messages between my parents and Isabella, discussing how to hide assets and manipulate trust fund distributions. They had also discovered that the shell companies my parents used were connected to a larger criminal network that had been defrauding rental housing programs across 3 states. Isabella's arrest was particularly satisfying because it occurred while she was in the middle of another social media campaign claiming to be the victim of my vindictive behavior. Federal agents arrested her at a coffee shop where she was meeting with a local reporter to discuss her story about family betrayal and financial abuse. The irony was not lost on anyone following the case. My parents' sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 months later, but their attorneys immediately began negotiating plea agreements in hopes of avoiding lengthy prison sentences. The federal prosecutor was not particularly sympathetic, given the extensive nature of their crimes and their attempts to manipulate the legal system to continue their fraud. David Morrison and Michael Thompson also faced serious professional consequences. Both attorneys were suspended from practicing law pending ethics investigations, and Morrison's firm was being audited by federal authorities for potential involvement in the criminal conspiracy. Thompson ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included disbarment and a substantial financial penalty. The financial restitution was substantial. My parents were required to surrender all rental properties, liquidate their hidden investment accounts, and pay back taxes with penalties totaling over $1.2 million. The family trust, which had been depleted by their embezzlement, was restored to its original value plus damages. Isabella was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Her social media accounts were monitored as part of her probation conditions after she continued posting defamatory content about me even after her conviction. My parents each received 36-month sentences, though they were allowed to serve their time in minimum security facilities due to their age and lack of violent criminal history. The most personally satisfying aspect of their downfall was watching their carefully constructed facade of respectability completely crumble. Extended family members who had been manipulated by their lies finally understood the full scope of their deception. Several relatives reached out to apologize for initially believing Isabella's victim narrative and supporting her campaign against me. Uncle William became an unexpected source of family wisdom during this difficult period. He helped me understand that my parents' criminal behavior reflected deep character flaws that had probably existed long before I was old enough to recognize them. Their willingness to steal from their own children's inheritance and manipulate the legal system revealed a level of moral corruption that went far beyond simple financial greed. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about chosen family versus biological family. My legal team, particularly Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Walsh, provided more loyalty and support during this crisis than my own parents ever had. Agent Rodriguez checked on my well-being throughout the investigation and helped me understand that being victimized by family members was unfortunately more common than most people realized. My colleagues at work also surprised me with their support once the full truth came out. Instead of being concerned about my involvement in legal proceedings, they were impressed by my courage in exposing criminal activity and standing up to family intimidation. My supervisor told me that my integrity under pressure had actually strengthened my reputation within the company. Rebuilding my relationship with extended family members required time and patience, but many relatives eventually became stronger allies than they had ever been before. My cousin Jennifer and I developed a much closer relationship based on honest communication rather than family obligation. Uncle William became like a surrogate father figure who provided guidance without manipulation or hidden agendas. The financial impact of this ordeal was ultimately positive, despite the substantial legal expenses I had incurred. The restoration of the family trust meant I would eventually inherit significantly more than I had originally expected. More importantly, I had learned to protect myself financially and legally in ways that would serve me well throughout my life. My house, which had been the catalyst for this entire conflict, became a symbol of my independence and resilience. I renovated it exactly the way I had originally envisioned, without having to consider anyone else's preferences or financial limitations. The house represented my ability to achieve my goals despite family sabotage and legal intimidation. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome was my newfound understanding of what healthy family relationships should look like. Through therapy and conversations with supportive relatives, I learned to recognize manipulation tactics and establish boundaries that protected my emotional and financial well-being. I also became an advocate for other people dealing with family financial abuse. My experience taught me that financial manipulation within families is often combined with emotional manipulation and legal intimidation. Many people stay trapped in toxic family situations because they do not realize that legal protections exist and that family members can be held accountable for criminal behavior. Looking back on this entire experience, I realized that my parents and Isabella did me an unintentional favor by revealing their true characters so dramatically. If they had been more subtle in their manipulation, I might have spent years or even decades being slowly drained financially and emotionally without understanding what was happening. The criminal investigation also revealed that other family members had been victims of my parents' financial schemes over the years. Several cousins and aunts discovered they had unknowingly participated in tax fraud or had been lied to about family financial matters. The federal prosecution helped these relatives understand their own victimization and take steps to protect themselves going forward. Today, I live peacefully in my beautiful house, surrounded by people who genuinely care about my well-being rather than my financial resources. I have learned that real family is defined by loyalty, honesty, and mutual support, rather than shared genetics or legal obligations. My parents and Isabella occasionally attempt to contact me from prison, usually around holidays or when they want money for commissary accounts. I have maintained complete no contact with all three of them, and my life has been dramatically more peaceful and fulfilling without their toxic influence. The legal system worked exactly as it was designed to work once we had competent representation and solid evidence. My initial fear that my family could use their resources to manipulate the courts proved unfounded once federal authorities became involved and the true scope of their crimes was revealed. This experience has made me a stronger, more independent person who understands the value of genuine relationships and the importance of protecting myself from people who would exploit family connections for personal gain. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to completely cut toxic people out of your life, even when those people are your immediate family members. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself from toxic behavior. What would you have done if your own parents had tried to steal your house and manipulate the legal system against you? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar family manipulation, because sometimes people need to know they are not alone in these struggles. Thank you for watching my story, and remember that justice sometimes takes time, but it usually finds a way to prevail when you have the courage to stand up for what is right. I hope my experience can help others recognize the warning signs of family financial abuse and find the strength to protect themselves when necessary.